Did you know that the devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel did not begin in the Middle Ages? It didn't even start with a medieval apparition. No, it began in the very heart of the Old Testament, on the peak of a sacred mountain, where a prophet gazed at the horizon and saw a tiny cloud. In that moment, centuries before she was even born, he saw the promise of Mary. The story of Our Lady of Mount Carmel is one of the oldest, the deepest, and the richest traditions in the entire history of the Church. It is a story that begins with Elijah on the heights of Carmel. It flows through the medieval hermits who built a humble chapel to the Virgin, and it reaches millions of faithful today who wear the brown scapular as a sign of total consecration, a sign of a mother who promised never to abandon her children. On July 16th, the Church doesn't just celebrate another title for Mary. We celebrate one of the most profound experiences of spiritual motherhood in human history. But before we go deeper into this mystery, I want to ask you, where are you watching us from today? Stop for a second and leave your city and your country in the comments. It is truly beautiful to see how far our community of faith reaches. And please, leave your prayer intentions to Our Lady of Mount Carmel below. We will pray together for every single request, because here, in this community, no one walks alone on the path of faith. Chapter 1. Mount Carmel, where heaven touches the earth. Before it was a symbol of a religious order or a worldwide devotion, Carmel was a sacred mountain where God manifested himself in ways the world has never forgotten. Mount Carmel is a majestic mountain range, stretching about 15 miles across northwestern Israel, ending in a dramatic cliff that plunges into the Mediterranean Sea near the city of Haifa. Its name in Hebrew, Carmel, literally means the Garden of God or the Vineyard of God, and that name was not an accident. In ancient times, Carmel was famous for its extraordinary fertility. It was covered in thick forests and blessed with hidden springs that made it a lush oasis in the middle of a harsh, arid landscape. To the ancients, it was one of the most beautiful places on earth. Biblical poets used it as the ultimate image of beauty and abundance whenever they wanted to describe the fullness of God's gifts. But Carmel was not just a pretty mountain. In the tradition of Israel, it was a place of power, a space where the presence of God was felt with an intense weight. The prophet Amos spoke of it as a symbol of the life God gives. Isaiah used it to describe the future glory of a restored people. And the Song of Solomon compared the beauty of the beloved to the majesty of Carmel. In the sacred geography of Israel, Carmel was the mountain of the north, the point where the sea meets the stone, a synthesis of beauty that was seen as a divine sign of God's generosity. From the very first centuries, Christian tradition saw this mountain as a prefiguration of Mary. The early church fathers, especially those from the mystical tradition of Alexandria, saw Carmel with its greenery, its fruitfulness, and its pure beauty as an image of the Virgin Mary. She is the true garden of God, the sacred soil where the Word of God took flesh. This wasn't just a poetic thought. It was a deep spiritual intuition. Just as Carmel was the most beautiful garden in Israel, Mary was the most perfect garden of humanity. She was the space where divine life bloomed in its purest form. When the first Christian hermits began to settle on Mount Carmel in the 3rd and 4th centuries, they didn't choose that spot by chance. They chose it because it was a place of prayer. They lived in the natural caves of the mountain, alternating between silent prayer and manual labor, following the footsteps of the Old Testament prophets. And from the very beginning, their eyes were fixed on Mary. They saw her as the perfect model of the contemplative life they were trying to live. This first chapter of Carmel's history reminds us of something critical. True Marian devotion is not just a feeling. It has deep roots in the history of salvation. It is theologically grounded. Our Lady of Mount Carmel is not just another pious tradition. She is a title that reaches back into the heart of the Old Covenant, expressing an ancient truth, that Mary is the garden of God, the place where divine life flourishes with the same abundance that once covered the most beautiful mountain in Israel. Chapter 2. Elijah's Little Cloud, the first prophecy of Mary. On the summit of Carmel, the prophet Elijah looked out over the sea, and he saw a tiny cloud. This moment, recorded in the first book of Kings, has always been seen by the Church as the very first prophecy of Mary's coming. This episode is one of the most dramatic in the entire Bible. For 3 long years, Israel had been suffering under a devastating drought. The land was cracked, the animals were dying, and the people were starving. This was the consequence of the idolatry of King Ahab and his queen, Jezebel, who had forced the people to worship Baal, the pagan god of rain and fertility. Elijah, the great prophet of the one true God, challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to a showdown on Mount Carmel. It was a battle for the soul of the nation. It was a test to see who truly ruled the heavens, Baal, or the Lord God of Israel. We know how that battle ended. Fire descended from heaven and consumed Elijah's sacrifice, proving that God is Lord. But what happened next is what truly matters for the history of Carmel. Elijah climbed to the very peak of the mountain. He bowed down to the earth, putting his face between his knees in a state of intense, agonizing prayer. He sent his servant to look toward the sea, to see if there was any sign of the rain God had promised. The servant went, and he came back with a chilling answer. "There is nothing." Elijah told him to go back, again and again. 6 times the servant returned with the same news. Nothing. But on the 7th time, everything changed. The servant came back and said, "Look, there is a little cloud, no bigger than a man's hand, rising out of the sea." That tiny, fragile cloud, rising from the salty waters of the ocean, was the prelude to a massive downpour. It was the sign of the abundant rain that would save Israel from death. But the fathers of the Church, specifically those who dipped their pens in the spiritual ink of the Carmelite tradition, saw in her something far greater than a mere weather event. St. John Damascene, Rupert of Deutz, and centuries of contemplatives have interpreted that little cloud as a prophetic prefiguration of the Virgin Mary herself. Think of it. She was small in the eyes of a prideful world, humble in her origin, and modest in her condition. Yet she was the sacred vessel, the bearer of the waters of grace that would save all of humanity from the scorched wasteland of sin. Just as that cloud, which Elijah beheld rising from the great sea, announced the rain that would restore life to the parched earth, so too did Mary bring Christ into our world, the living water who quenches the deepest thirst of the human heart. The depth of this typology is staggering. It reveals Elijah as the very first Marian prophet in history, long before Mary walked the earth. This mystery has been meditated upon for centuries by the theologians and anchorites of the Carmel, a richness of thought that no simple summary could ever exhaust. Elijah waited. He waited with a patience that refused to yield to the crushing weight of despair. 6 times he looked out, and 6 times the horizon appeared empty. Yet 6 times he continued to labor in prayer. He continued to hope. On the 7th time, the promised sign finally arrived. This persevering wait, repeated 7 times with a fidelity that did not depend on immediate results, is the perfect image of the contemplative prayer that the Carmel offers us as a spiritual path. It is a prayer that does not demand instant gratification, but trusts completely in the tempo of God. The significance of this moment for our devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel is twofold and profoundly complementary. On one hand, it places Mary at the very center of salvation history, with an antiquity that precedes even the greatest prophets. Long before Isaiah, long before the major prophetic writers, Elijah had already glimpsed her figure in that little cloud hovering over the Carmel. On the other hand, it provides the model of prayer that Carmelite devotion seeks to cultivate in the faithful, a prayer that is patient, perseverant, and utterly confident. It is a prayer that does not surrender, even when the horizon of our lives seems vast and empty, because it knows, with divine certainty, that the promised cloud will arrive in God's perfect time. Chapter 3. The Hermits of Mount Carmel, men who chose Mary as their protectress. In the 12th century, a group of European crusaders and pilgrims settled upon the heights of Mount Carmel. They built a small chapel in honor of the Blessed Mother, and without knowing it, they founded the Carmelite order. The documented history of the order begins in the latter half of the 12th century, when these pilgrims, drawn by the spiritual gravity of Mount Carmel and the ancient examples of the prophets, retreated into the caves of the mountain's western slope. They sought a life of solitude, of deep prayer, and of penance, echoing the life of the Old Testament prophets and the Desert Fathers. Among these early anchorites, tradition tells of a pilgrim from Calabria named Berthold, who is remembered as the founder of the community, though the exact historical details of those early days remain shrouded in the mystery of the past. What is historically certain, however, is that around the year 1209, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Albert of Vercelli, drafted a rule of life for this community. This rule would become the divine blueprint for all future legislation of the order. It was remarkable for its brevity and for its rigor. It established the pillars of Carmelite existence: life in individual cells, unceasing prayer, manual labor, the weight of silence, and strict abstinence. The oratory, which the rule commanded them to build, was to be the heart of their community, and at the explicit request of the hermits, it was dedicated to Our Lady, whom they venerated as the mother and patroness of their brotherhood from the very beginning. This dedication of their central chapel to the Virgin Mary was not merely a pious addition. It was the expression of a fundamental theological conviction. For these hermits, Mary was not just one object of devotion among many. She was the supreme model of the contemplative life they were striving to lead. She was the one who had most perfectly kept and meditated upon the Word of God in her heart. She was the one who lived with the greatest fidelity the attitude of listening and total surrender. The hermits of Carmel did not just venerate Mary. They sought to imitate her, to live as she lived, and to pray as she prayed. But history took a dark turn. The expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land at the end of the 13th century forced these hermits to flee to Europe. They settled in England, France, Italy, and beyond, gradually transforming their way of life from pure hermits to mendicant friars, becoming more like the Franciscans and Dominicans of the age. This process of adaptation, which was fraught with tension and internal debate regarding their original spirit, was also the moment when devotion to Mary solidified as the most distinctive mark of the Carmelite identity. Many things in the external life of the order could change, but their consecration to Mary remained the cornerstone upon which everything else was built. It was in this context, this difficult transplanting to European soil, that the episode occurred which would give the devotion its most universal expression. The apparition of the Virgin to Simon Stock and the gift of the brown scapular. This moment, which tradition places in the year 1251, was not the origin of Carmelite devotion to Mary, but rather its divine confirmation. It was the moment when a devotion that had existed since the dawn of the order received a concrete sign, a sign that would make this spirituality accessible to millions of faithful souls far beyond the monastery walls. Chapter 4. The Apparition to Simon Stock and the Scapular. On July the 16th, 1251, the Virgin Mary delivered to an elderly prior general the sign that would identify her devotees for centuries to come. Simon Stock was an Englishman of noble birth. He had embraced the Carmelite life after years as a solitary hermit, and around the year 1247, he was elected prior general during one of the most turbulent and difficult chapters in the order's history. The Carmelites, recently arrived from the sacred sands of the Holy Land, found themselves as strangers in a foreign and often hostile Europe. They were in a profound state of transition, a season of agonizing adaptation where their very survival hung in the balance. They faced obstacles from every side, the fierce resistance of other religious orders who viewed these newcomers with suspicion, questioning their identity and their very right to exist within the Western Church. Inside the order, tensions simmered between those who clung to the original eremitic spirit of the desert and those who saw the desperate need to adapt to the life of the mendicant friars. It was a time of shadows, a season of profound uncertainty for an institution still searching for its place in the heart of Western Christendom. In this crucible of doubt and hardship, tradition tells us of a man whose shoulders were heavy with the weight of his brothers. Simon Stock, now an elder, and burdened with the immense responsibility of his office, he turned to prayer with an intensity that can only be born from true desperation. For years, he had invoked the intercession of the Blessed Mother with a devotion that witnesses of the era described as exceptional, even for an order that claimed Mary as its sovereign patroness. The prayer that has echoed through the centuries, attributed to his trembling lips, is a masterpiece of filial trust. Flos Carmeli, vitis florigera splendor caeli, virgo puerpera singularis, flower of Carmel, flowering vine, splendor of heaven, mother mild, who none other like hast known. This was an antiphon that invoked the Queen of Heaven, using the richest imagery of biblical and patristic tradition, a cry from the soul for the garden of God to bloom once more. On the 16th of July, in the year 1251, the veil between heaven and earth was pulled back. According to the sacred testimony preserved by tradition, the Virgin Mary appeared to Simon Stock. In her hands, she held the brown scapular, a small portion of the Carmelite habit that would, from that moment on, become the mark of her chosen children. Her words have resonated through the corridors of history, shaping the devotion of millions. Receive, my beloved son, the scapular of your order as a sign of my confraternity, a privilege for you and for all the children of Carmel. He who dies clothed in this shall not suffer eternal fire. It is a sign of salvation, a safeguard in times of peril, a covenant of peace, and an everlasting pact. These words, though transmitted in various versions, carry a consistent and powerful promise, interpreted by the Carmelites as a maternal guarantee of special intercession for all who consecrate themselves to her under this holy sign. Now, we must acknowledge that the exact historicity of Simon Stock's vision has been a subject of scholarly debate. Modern historians note that the earliest written accounts of this specific episode appeared decades after it occurred. However, this academic inquiry does not diminish the profound theological and devotional truth at the heart of the scapular. The devotion, regardless of the minute details of its origin, expresses a deep spiritual reality that the Church has recognized, tested, and approved for centuries. The promise of Mary does not rest solely on the ink of a medieval manuscript, but on the unfailing spiritual maternity of the Mother of God, a truth the Church has always championed. What remains historically undeniable is the rapidity with which this devotion swept across the world. Starting in the 13th century, the scapular moved far beyond the monastery walls, reaching the faithful of every social class who yearned to share in the spirituality of Carmel. Popes granted indulgences to those who wore it. Preachers spoke of its power from the pulpits, and spiritual giants such as Saint Francis de Sales, Saint Charles Borromeo, and Saint Alphonsus Liguori did not just wear the scapular themselves. They promoted it actively as a primary tool for sanctification. This extraordinary expansion proves that the scapular answered a real, burning spiritual need, the need for a tangible sign of consecration, a way for any Christian to place themselves under the protective mantle of the Virgin. Chapter 5. The theological meaning of the scapular. A habit, not an amulet. To truly unlock the power of the scapular, we must understand what it is and what it is not. One of the most frequent and dangerous misunderstandings in the history of this devotion is the idea that the scapular is an amulet, a magic charm that automatically saves the wearer regardless of their heart or their sins. This magic interpretation has been explicitly rejected by the Church on numerous occasions. It is contrary to the very essence of the sign that Mary entrusted to Simon Stock. The scapular is, first and foremost, a habit. It is a miniature version of the religious garment worn by the Carmelites. When a layperson receives the scapular, they are performing a symbolic act identical to a novice entering the order. They are clothing themselves in an external sign that reflects an internal reality of consecration. Just as the monk's habit is a visible sign of a life surrendered to God, the scapular is a sign of the layman's desire to participate in the spirit of Carmel, to seek the humility, the purity of heart, and the constant prayer that Mary herself lived. In 2002, the Congregation for Divine Worship provided a definition of striking clarity. The scapular of Carmel is a sign of Marian consecration, involving a commitment to follow the example of the Virgin in her perfect adherence to Christ. This reveals the true nature of the gift. It is not a magic object. It is a relationship. It does not function through mechanical ritual, but through a genuine, interior movement of the soul toward God. The promise that those who die in the scapular will not suffer eternal fire must be understood through this lens of grace. It does not mean the scapular is a get-out-of-hell-free card for those who refuse to repent. Rather, it means that Mary promises to intercede powerfully at the moment of death for those who have lived in a state of consecration to her. Her spiritual motherhood accompanies her children in their final hour, working in harmony with human freedom, not against it. For the one who understands it correctly, wearing the scapular is not a gesture of superstition. It is an act of filial trust and a lifelong commitment to the path of holiness. It is to say to Mary, I desire to be yours. I want to live according to your spirit. I desire that your spiritual motherhood accompany me at every single moment of my life, including the most critical and definitive of all, the hour of my death. This profound trust, when it is authentic and matched by a sincere effort to live a Christian life, finds in Mary a response that tradition and the experience of millions of devotees have confirmed throughout the centuries. Chapter 6. The Sabbatine Privilege, the Promise of the First Saturday. One of the oldest traditions of Carmelite devotion promises that Mary herself will descend into purgatory on the very first Saturday following the death of her devoted children. This so-called Sabbatine privilege is one of the most beautiful and yet one of the most debated traditions of Carmelite spirituality. According to this tradition, often associated with a papal bull from Pope John XXIV in the 14th century, Mary made a striking promise. She would descend into the depths of purgatory on the first Saturday after a devotee passes away, to lead them swiftly into the glory of heaven. To receive this grace, the devotee must have faithfully worn the brown scapular, observed chastity according to their state in life, and prayed the canonical hours, or for those who cannot read them, the little office of the Blessed Virgin, or a specific number of Hail Marys. This promise, which captures the certainty that Mary's spiritual motherhood does not end at the grave, but accompanies the soul through the fire of purification, has been a source of immeasurable comfort for the faithful across the ages. Now, the historical debate over the authenticity of the ancient decree is complex and perhaps never fully resolved. But what remains strikingly clear is the theological conviction it represents. The Church has long taught that Mary's intercession reaches even the souls in purgatory, that her motherly care is not severed at the threshold of death, and that a child's devotion to her in this life has consequences that echo throughout eternity. The practice of the first Saturdays, promoted in various forms by many Marian traditions, expresses this same conviction, that the love of Mary for her children has no temporal borders. In the heart of Christian tradition, Saturday holds a deeply Marian dimension. It is the day when, between the death of Christ and his glorious resurrection, Mary alone kept the flame of faith alive. When the apostles had fled, when the hope of the disciples seemed utterly extinguished, it was Mary who remained faithful to the divine promise. This Saturday of solitary faith is the very foundation of why we consecrate this day to her memory. The Sabbatine privilege, promising her descent into purgatory on a Saturday to release her children, weaves this ancient tradition with the hope of her post-mortem intercession in a way that the human heart finds deeply consoling. For the faithful today, the Sabbatine privilege must not be understood as an invitation to moral laziness or a guarantee of automatic salvation. Instead, it is a profound expression of trust in a mother who never abandons her children, even beyond the veil. This trust, far from relaxing our moral efforts, should intensify them. He who trusts that Mary will walk with him in his most difficult hour has every reason to honor that trust by living a life consistent with the consecration of the scapular. The Sabbatine privilege is a promise of maternal love, and true love always demands a commitment from the one who receives it. Chapter 7. Our Lady of Mount Carmel and the Contemplative Life. Mount Carmel has produced some of the most profound treatises on the interior life in all of Christian history, and Mary is the invisible center of that entire spiritual world. Carmelite spirituality possesses a unique signature that distinguishes it from all others, a radical orientation toward contemplation, seeking union with God through interior prayer rather than outward action. This does not mean Carmelites despise active service, but they believe that action is only fruitful when it springs from a well of deep contemplation, and that silence is the highest service the Church can offer to a noisy world. At the core of this silence stands the figure of Mary, seen not just as a statue to be honored, but as the very model of the interior attitude Carmel seeks to cultivate. Mary, who kept all these things and pondered them in her heart, is the first and most perfect contemplative of the Christian era. She lived that attitude of attentive listening, that total surrender to the Word of God, which is the essence of prayer. The Masters of Carmel do not present Mary as an unreachable ideal, but as a concrete path. He who learns to pray as Mary prayed, to listen as Mary listened, and to love as Mary loved, finds in her the most direct access to the heart of her Son. This sacred bond is expressed in the very architecture of Carmelite monasteries, where the chapel dedicated to Our Lady always takes the central place. Here, the friars and sisters spend countless hours in prayer before her image, finding in her the perfect mirror of a humanity completely surrendered to God. To watch Mary in prayer is to learn, by a kind of spiritual osmosis, the life she lived: confident abandonment, attentive listening, and an unreserved availability to the Father's will. The spiritual writers of Carmel have meditated on this connection with a depth that forms the most precious heritage of Christian literature. Saint John of the Cross, the most rigorous of mystics, presented Mary as the model for the dark night of the soul, that process of purification where God leads the soul to union. Saint Teresa of Avila, practical and direct, pointed to Mary as the model of humility and availability. And Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, the little flower, found in Mary the perfect image of her little way, the path of spiritual childhood, which is essentially the path of a child resting securely in the arms of its mother. Chapter 8. The Saints of Carmel, Teresa, John of the Cross, and the little Thérèse. The three doctors of the Church that Carmel has gifted to the world are more than just historical figures. They are the three greatest masters of the interior life produced by the Christian tradition in the last 1,000 years. Carmel has bestowed upon the Church a concentration of intellectual and spiritual sanctity that no other religious order has matched in such a brief span of time. Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus, though they were canonized in different eras and emerged from vastly different historical contexts, they share a single, profound vision of the spiritual journey. It is the relentless pursuit of unbreakable union with God through interior purification, contemplative prayer, and a radical, trusting abandonment into His hands, always with Mary as their preeminent model and guide. Saint Teresa of Avila, the great reformer of the 16th century, was a woman of such vibrant energy and vitality that her spirit could have been consumed by 1,000 worldly ambitions. But grace intervened, redirecting that fire toward the reform of the contemplative life and toward the mapping of the soul's deepest recesses. Her two crowning masterpieces, The Way of Perfection and The Interior Castle, stand today as the most complete and wisdom-filled maps of the spiritual territory ever produced. Teresa did not speak of the interior life as a mere theorist. She spoke as an explorer, chronicling with sharp precision and a touch of humor the territories she had personally traversed. Her devotion to Mary, which saturates her entire body of work, was never merely sentimental. It was the sacred confidence of a daughter in a mother who knew the way because she had walked it with absolute perfection. Saint John of the Cross, Teresa's companion in the reform of Carmel, took this spiritual exploration to depths that few authors have ever dared to reach. His writings, most notably The Ascent of Mount Carmel and The Dark Night of the Soul, describe with a precision that borders on the ineffable the processes of purification, those moments where God strips the soul of its earthly attachments to lead it into divine union. The poetry that flows through these prose treatises is of such haunting beauty that even secular critics recognize it as the absolute peak of Spanish literature. In John of the Cross, theology and poetry are forged into a synthesis that is only possible when the writer has lived, in his own flesh, the celestial realities he describes. Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus, the most recent of the three Carmelite doctors, passed into eternity in 1897 at the tender age of 24. Behind her, she left an autobiography and a handful of writings that the Church would, in 1997, recognize as having universal doctrinal value, proclaiming her a doctor of the Church. Her little way, which she described as the path of spiritual childhood, is perhaps the most accessible and profound proposal in all of Carmelite spirituality. It is not a path of grand asceticism or extraordinary visions, but of loving fidelity to the smallest things, a filial trust in God that relies not on one's own merits, but on the love that transforms every moment of life into a sacred offering. This doctrine, which Thérèse developed in response to her own perceived limitations, has guided and consoled millions of souls who saw themselves in her smallness, finding a path to sanctity that requires no extraordinary circumstances, only extraordinary love. These three doctors of Carmel are also three living witnesses to the spiritual maternity of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Teresa of Avila, who placed her convents under Mary's patronage. John of the Cross, who penned some of the most beautiful Marian reflections in literature, and the little Therese, who, on her deathbed, consecrated an act of love to Mary that summarized her entire spirituality. They are three distinct voices singing the same melody, the melody of filial love for a mother who knew how to lead them, each by their own unique path, toward the full encounter with her Son. Chapter 9. The Feast of July 16th. History and Liturgy. The liturgical celebration of Our Lady of Mount Carmel carries a history that mirrors the growth of this devotion within the heart of the Universal Church. The date of July the 16th, as the feast day of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, is inextricably linked to the tradition of the year 1251, the day when the Virgin appeared to Simon's stock and delivered the brown scapular. The Carmelites began celebrating this date as the preeminent feast of their order in the early centuries of their life in Europe, and the devotion surrounding it grew so powerfully that it eventually transcended the walls of the cloister, becoming a celebration for the entire Catholic world. In 1726, Pope Benedict XIII extended the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel to the Universal Church, formally recognizing a devotion that had already captured the hearts of the faithful across every social class and every nation. This extension was not merely an administrative decree, it was a solemn recognition of a spiritual reality, that Our Lady of Mount Carmel was no longer just the treasure of a religious order, but one of the most beloved forms of Marian piety in existence. The liturgical celebration of July 16th has a unique texture, a sacred solemnity that distinguishes it from other Marian feasts. The reading of the prophet Elijah and the little cloud rising over Mount Carmel, which is central to the liturgy of the Word, connects this celebration to the deepest roots of salvation history. It is a typological prefiguration of the Virgin herself. The hymns and chants of Carmel, rich with imagery of the desert, the mountain, and the garden, express a relationship with Mary that is both intimate and theologically profound. And the blessing of the scapulars, which so often accompanies this feast, is the moment where individual devotion becomes a communal act of consecration. In many cultures, throughout the Mediterranean and Latin America, the 16th of July takes on a vibrant popular dimension. Grand processions, the blessing of the sea in coastal towns, the distribution of the brown scapular to the faithful. These expressions of popular piety, which the Church has purified and embraced, are the living proof that Our Lady of Mount Carmel has taken deep root in the hearts of the people. The Feast of July 16th is, in Carmelite spirituality, a moment of renewal, a time to recommit to the covenant expressed by the scapular, the religious brothers and sisters of Carmel, the dedicated members of the Third Orders, the faithful within the ancient confraternities, and the untold millions of souls who wear the brown scapular across every corner of the globe, all find in this annual celebration a sacred opportunity. It is a moment to return to the very wellspring of their devotion, to reaffirm the solemn consecration they have made to Mary, and to renew their unwavering commitment to live according to the spirit she embodies. In this profound sense, July 16th is far more than a mere date on a calendar. It is a spiritual compass, a fixed point of reference that guides the inner life of all those who recognize themselves as true children of Carmel. Chapter 10. The brown scapular in the modern age, a devotion that defies the passage of time. 15 centuries have unfolded since the first anchorites sought God in the silence of Mount Carmel, and nearly 800 years have passed since the great promise was delivered into the hands of Simon Stock. Yet, despite the vast gulf of time, the devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel remains one of the most vibrant and widespread traditions in the entire history of the Church. We live in a world that shifts at a dizzying speed, a world where cultural and religious forms often become obsolete within a few short years. In this landscape of constant change, the devotion to the Carmelite scapular presents a paradoxical phenomenon. It possesses a persistence and a vitality that utterly defy modern expectations. Millions of the faithful, belonging to the most diverse generations and representing vastly different cultural backgrounds, continue to wear this small piece of brown wool as a perpetual sign of their consecration to Our Lady. Today, in our contemporary world, the testimonies of profound conversions, of supernatural graces, and of spiritual consolations received through this devotion continue to multiply without end. This enduring vitality is not difficult to explain for those who grasp the profound mystery of the scapular. In a world suffering from a widespread loss of belonging, where the very capacity for lasting commitment seems to be fading, the scapular offers a concrete sign of an allegiance that does not waver. It does not depend on the fleeting emotions of the moment, but on a sacred decision made by the devotee and blessed by the Church herself. In an age marked by a crushing sense of loneliness and abandonment, the scapular provides the absolute certainty that a mother is watching. Her spiritual motherhood is not a poetic metaphor. It is a living reality that acts concretely in the daily lives of her children. The devotion to the scapular has found new, powerful forms of expression in the modern world that do not contradict, but rather enrich the ancient tradition, the confraternities, which unite the devotees of Our Lady of Mount Carmel into communities of prayer and apostolic mission, continue to serve as vital spiritual anchors in countless parishes worldwide. Carmelite retreats, which offer the faithful and authentic experience of the interior life, draw people of all ages and walks of life. They seek the depth that a superficial spiritual existence can never provide. Furthermore, the rapid diffusion of the writings of the great Carmelite doctors, made possible by today's technology, carries the timeless wisdom of Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and the Little Flower, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, to corners of the earth that no missionary could have reached in centuries past. Pope John Paul II, who wore the brown scapular throughout his entire life, from his youth to his long pontificate, expressed on many occasions his firm conviction that the devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel responds to a deep spiritual hunger in the modern man. It is the hunger to feel accompanied by a maternal presence that never abandons us. The need for a tangible sign of consecration that serves as a constant reminder of our life's true purpose. His holy example, followed by so many other shepherds of the Church, stands as the most eloquent testament to the relevance of this devotion. 15 centuries of history have confirmed it as one of the surest paths to union with God through the hands of Mary. Prayer to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. O Virgin of Carmel, Queen and Mother of all who seek God in the hidden paths of the interior life, on this, your great feast day, we present ourselves before you with the gratitude and the unwavering trust of your children. From the heights of Mount Carmel, prefigured by that little cloud that the prophet Elijah beheld rising from the sea, you have accompanied the Church through centuries of trial and triumph. We ask you now to accept our prayer and our renewed consecration. Mother of Carmel, intercede for all of us who wear your holy scapular as a sign of our total belonging to you. May this outward sign always correspond to an authentic interior reality, a life of true Christian consecration. Let us never reduce this garment to a mere charm or amulet, but let us live it for what it truly is, the holy habit of those who have chosen to be yours, and to walk with you along the narrow path of the gospel. Teach us the way of contemplative prayer, which you lived with absolute perfection, as you kept and pondered the words and mysteries of your Son within your heart. Teach us to create spaces of silence in our busy lives where God can find us. Help us to hear his voice above the deafening noise of the world, and to respond to his call with the same total surrender of your own heart. Let it be done unto me according to thy word. Intercede, we beseech you, for the Carmelite order and for all who live according to its spirit. Protect the religious brothers and sisters who, in the silence of their cloisters, lift up the prayers that sustain the world. Watch over the lay Carmelites and members of the confraternities who strive to live the spirituality of Carmel in the midst of the secular world. May your spiritual motherhood accompany them in every step of their vocation. Grant us, O Virgin of Mount Carmel, the singular grace of a happy death, surrounded by your maternal presence. When the moment arrives for us to cross the threshold from this life into eternity, may we find in you the mother who promised never to abandon her children, especially in that supreme and final hour. Lead us then, as you have always led us, toward your Son, Jesus Christ, in whom we shall find the fullness of the love we began to glimpse here on earth. Amen.